What if calming your nervous system took only 60 seconds of cold water? Near 30 seconds in, his breathing slowed down, all on its own. Hear his full story, only on The Art of Aging.
Natural health tips rarely start with a cold shower, but a 68-year-old man I know found something in 60 seconds of cold water that decades of worry had never once let go of. Stay with me, because this one surprised even me. I'll call him Frank, 68 years old, a lifelong warrior, the kind of man whose shoulders had lived up near his ears for so long he no longer noticed they were there. It wasn't dramatic, the way he carried it. He wasn't a man who talked about anxiety or would have used that word for himself at all. He was simply, quietly, always braced. His wife used to joke, gently, that Frank braced for bad news even in the middle of good news, that she could hand him a lottery ticket and he'd check first for the catch. She passed 4 years ago after a long illness that Frank nursed her through with a steadiness that surprised even his own children. But after she was gone, the bracing that had always lived in him didn't ease the way grief is supposed to eventually loosen its grip. It settled in instead, permanently, like weather that moves into a region and simply never moves back out. His doctor, at his last physical, mentioned that his resting heart rate was running a little higher than they'd like to see. His sleep, when Frank described it, sounded thin. Hours logged, but not much rest actually happening inside them. His digestion had grown unpredictable in the way stress quietly rearranges a body's basic functions without ever announcing itself as the cause. Frank chalked all of it up to grief and to age, two things he'd always assumed you were simply meant to endure silently, the way his own father had. His son, home for a week after a work trip through Scandinavia, mentioned something he'd picked up along the way. An old, somewhat unusual habit, apparently common in colder countries, of ending a normal warm shower with a burst of cold water, sometimes as long as a minute. Frank thought the whole idea sounded faintly ridiculous, the kind of thing younger people do for attention on the internet. He said as much to his son. His son just shrugged and said it wasn't for attention where he'd seen it done. It was just something people did, quietly, most mornings, the way you'd brush your teeth. Frank tried it anyway. Mostly, he admitted later, just to prove his son wrong. One Tuesday morning, at the end of his usual shower, he reached over and turned the handle fully to cold. The first 10 seconds, he said, felt like an alarm going off inside his own chest. A full-body flinch, his breath catching sharp and high, every instinct in him screaming to turn the water back to warm immediately. He almost did. His hand was actually reaching for the handle. But something, stubbornness maybe, or simple curiosity about whether his son had been telling the truth, made him hold on a few seconds longer. And then, somewhere near the 30-second mark, something happened that he genuinely was not expecting. His breath, which had been sharp, shallow, and fast since the moment the cold hit, began to slow down on its own, without him doing anything deliberate to make it happen. He said it felt almost like his body had simply given up fighting the cold and decided instead to settle into it. Here's the honest mechanism behind what Frank felt, without overselling any of it. Sudden cold exposure activates something called the vagus nerve, a long, wandering nerve that runs from the base of your brainstem down through your neck, your chest, and into your gut, touching nearly every major organ along the way. It's often described as acting like a brake pedal for your nervous system. When your body senses a threat, real or perceived, a looming deadline, a difficult memory, simple chronic worry, it shifts into a heightened alert state, often called fight or flight, driven largely by the sympathetic nervous system. The vagus nerve is part of the opposing system, the parasympathetic side, responsible for calming things back down, slowing the heart rate, easing digestion, telling the body it's safe to stand down. In short, controlled bursts. Cold water exposure appears to stimulate this vagal brake quite directly. The initial shock of cold water actually does spike heart rate and blood pressure for the first several seconds. That's the alarmed feeling Frank described at the very start. But as the body adjusts, for many people, the vagus nerve engages and heart rate settles, often lower than it was even before the cold water started. It's a kind of induced calm, arrived at through a brief detour through discomfort. The nervous system essentially practicing the transition from alert to settled, in miniature, in under a minute. There's also a metabolic layer worth understanding, involving something called brown fat, a distinct kind of fat tissue, different from the fat most people think of, that exists specifically to generate heat by burning energy, rather than simply storing it for later. Babies have quite a lot of brown fat, which helps them regulate body temperature before they're able to shiver effectively. Adults have less, and it tends to decline further with age. Some research suggests that regular, brief cold exposure may help activate and even modestly increase this metabolically active tissue over time, though this remains an active area of ongoing study rather than a settled certainty. None of this is a cure for anything, and cold water is not, on its own, a solution to grief or chronic worry. But for many people, it appears to be one of the simplest, most immediately accessible tools available for briefly interrupting a nervous system that has been stuck in overdrive for longer than it should have been. You don't need an ice bath, and you certainly don't need to start where Frank eventually landed. At the very end of a normal warm shower, simply turn the water to cold for as little as 10 to 15 seconds to begin with. Breathing slowly and deliberately through it, rather than gasping, which only reinforces the alarm response instead of calming it. Try to keep your breath long and even, in through the nose if you can manage it, even as every instinct urges short, sharp breathing. Build gradually, over a period of weeks rather than days, toward longer durations. The full 60 seconds Frank eventually reached only after nearly a month of small, incremental increases, not a single dramatic leap. There's no need to rush toward any particular number. The benefit seems to come from the practice itself, repeated consistently more than from any specific duration. This approach genuinely isn't for everyone. Anyone with heart conditions, uncontrolled high blood pressure, or circulation issues should check with a doctor before trying this, since the initial cold shock does briefly raise heart rate and blood pressure before any calming effect follows, a spike that could be risky for some individuals. If you feel dizzy, unusually short of breath, or unwell at any point, stop immediately and return to warm water. What actually moved me most about Frank's story wasn't the science, though the science is genuinely interesting. It was something he said several weeks later, once the cold water had quietly become a fixed part of his morning, no longer something he had to talk himself into. He said, "For 60 seconds, I can't think about anything except being cold, and when it's over, I forget to be tense." Grief doesn't disappear in a shower. Decades of quiet worry don't unwind themselves in 60 seconds of cold water, no matter how consistently you practice it. Frank still missed his wife every single day. His shoulders, most of the time, still lived up near his ears. None of that changed. Not really. Not in any way you could point to and call resolved. But for 60 seconds, once a day, Frank found something he hadn't expected to find at 68 years old. After everything he'd already lost and braced against and quietly endured, he found a place where his own body demanded his full attention so completely that there simply wasn't room left over for anything else. Not the grief, not the worry, not the low, constant hum of bracing that had lived in him for as long as anyone in his family could remember. The cold didn't erase any of it. It just briefly made room, a door his nervous system could walk through, however involuntarily, into a version of himself that wasn't holding his breath against the next bad thing. He told his son, eventually, that it was the first time in years he'd felt something in his body he hadn't chosen to feel. That wasn't grief, and wasn't worry, and wasn't the particular ache of missing someone. Just cold. And then, on the other side of it, quiet. A body reminded, 60 seconds at a time, what it felt like to simply exist inside itself. Present, unbraced, if only for a moment, before the towel and the day ahead came rushing back in. 60 seconds of cold water at the end of a normal shower, built up gradually over weeks rather than forced all at once, appears for many people to calm the nervous system by way of the vagus nerve, and may offer a modest metabolic benefit through brown fat activation over time. Small, essentially free, and for Frank, it turned out to be surprisingly present-making. A minute of simply being in his body instead of braced against his own life. This is one man's story and general information, not medical advice. Cold water exposure isn't appropriate for everyone, particularly those with heart conditions, high blood pressure, or circulation issues. Please consult your doctor before trying this. If someone you love has been bracing for a long time, send them this one and follow @Art of Aging Podcast for the next story.